The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of sagebrush and smoke. The sun had vanished behind jagged cliffs, leaving the world in a dim amber glow, the kind that made shadows seem alive. She had always been careful, always wary, but that night was different. She didn't know it then, but the choices she made in the dark would cost her more than she could ever imagine. Across the dry creek bed, a man stumbled, trapped by the chaos of bandits and the unforgiving desert. He was not hers to save, yet something inside her flared, a stubborn spark that refused to let fear rule her. By the time the last shot echoed into silence, he was alive and she had lost everything she had built her life upon. Her hands were trembling as she searched for any sign that the Apache had survived the attack. The desert was cruel, and the night harsher still. She remembered his eyes, dark and haunted, reflecting a mixture of gratitude and something she couldn't name. She had seen men like him before, strong, silent, and dangerous, but there had been a softness there too, hidden behind the warrior's mask. She had risked her life to pull him from the path of death, unaware that in doing so she had opened a door that could never be closed. When dawn finally broke, washing the canyon walls in pale gold, she realized she had nothing left to cling to. Her home had been destroyed, the small town she had called her own reduced to ash and dust. The weight of loss settled over her like the desert heat, relentless and suffocating. Years passed, and the memory of that night never faded. She moved quietly through the world, carrying the shadows of her choices with her. Every wind that rustled the dry grass whispered reminders of the man she had saved and the life she had forfeited. People in the town still remembered her, though not always kindly. Some spoke of courage, others of folly. She no longer answered to their judgments. Survival had taught her the hard truth. You can save someone and still pay a price. The night she saved him had rewritten her destiny. The desert had a long memory. Meanwhile, far from the canyon, the Apache had lived with his own burdens. He had survived, yes, but the world he returned to was not the same as the one he had left. The violence and betrayal of that night had etched itself into his heart, shaping him in ways she could not have known. He wandered, silent and watchful, carrying the debt he owed her like a sacred burden. In moments of quiet reflection, he thought of her, the woman who had risked everything for a stranger. The desert taught patience, and he learned it well, waiting for the day he could repay the favor, though he had no idea if she would ever see him again. Her life, in the meantime, was a careful balance between hope and resignation. She worked the land, tending to the small cabin that survived the fires, though it was barely more than a skeleton of the home she had known. She kept to herself mostly, the townsfolk's whispers a constant background hum she tried to ignore. At night she would sit by the window, listening to the wind sweep through the canyon, thinking of him. The memory was sharp, like a blade she carried quietly in her heart. She could almost hear his voice over the wind, almost see the shadows of the night when their fates had collided. And still, she hoped, despite herself, that he had found peace, that somehow the world had spared him as it had not spared her. The day he returned was unmarked by warning. He appeared on the horizon like a figure from a dream, dust swirling around his boots, the sun glinting off the small ornaments he carried. His face had changed lines of survival etched into skin, bronzed by the desert sun, but his eyes, those same dark, haunted eyes, recognized her instantly. The weight of years hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. She didn't know whether to trust him, whether to welcome him, or to turn and run from the ghosts he had carried across the land. There was a tension in the air, a quiet storm, the kind that promised reckoning. He came to her door without ceremony, his presence alone demanding attention. In his hands he carried not just gifts or relics, but pieces of a past she had buried deep, remnants of a night that had altered both their lives forever. She felt her breath catch, the blood rushing in her ears. The world seemed to tilt, the canyon walls bending in the distance, as if holding its own breath. She wanted answers, yet feared them. The desert had been patient, and now it demanded she be the same. Every choice she had made since that night felt fragile, as if one wrong move could unravel the fragile thread that still connected them. She studied him, trying to read the years in his face, the lines of hardship and survival. He was no longer just a man in need of rescue. He He was a force that carried the weight of debts repaid and promises unspoken. The wind shifted, and the distant cry of a coyote made her heart race. There was danger, yes, but also a strange hope, something she hadn't dared to feel in years. She realized that their story, their connection, had never truly ended. The night she had saved him had left scars on both of them. But perhaps it had also left something else, something that could not be destroyed by time, fire or loss. And yet, even as he stood there, the silence between them heavy with meaning, she sensed there was more to come. The Apache's return was only the beginning, a signal that the past could no longer be ignored. She wanted to ask him why he had come, what he carried for her, but the words lodged in her throat. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching longer than the last. The canyon seemed to watch them, a silent witness to lives shaped by courage, loyalty, and loss. She could feel the shift, the moment when the past and present would collide, and she knew that whatever happened next would change everything once again. The shadows of the night stretched across the dusty porch, curling around them like fingers of memory. Her hand hovered near the doorframe, unsure whether to welcome him or retreat. His gaze did not waver, steady and unyielding, holding stories she was not yet ready to hear. Somewhere deep in the canyon, the wind whispered secrets only the desert knew, and she realized that her life, her choices, and even the cost of that long-ago night were about to come to the surface. The Apache had returned, and with him the echoes of the past echoes that demanded reckoning. The question remained, would she reclaim what she had lost, or would the price of that night claim her once more? The sun dipped low, burning the horizon in shades of red and gold. She and the Apache stood in silence, the desert holding its breath. The years of separation, the sacrifices, and the losses hung between them like an invisible wall. Then, in a moment that felt suspended in time, he reached into the bag he carried. Whatever was inside glimmered faintly in the dying light, a promise of restitution, of answers, of something she hadn't dared hope for in years. She wanted to speak, to demand explanation, yet the words eluded her. The night was coming, thick and dark, and with it, the inevitability of confrontation. The Apache had returned, but the story was far from over, and she realized that the night she had saved him had only been the first chapter of a tale that was just beginning. The Apache did not speak immediately. He set the bag down carefully, the weight of it settling into the dust like it belonged there, like it had always been meant to return to this place. She studied him closely, noticing the lines in his face, the subtle movements that spoke of long nights spent watching, waiting, surviving. His presence carried a quiet authority, the kind that comes from knowing the world is both beautiful and cruel. For a moment she almost thought he might simply leave again, that he might vanish into the shadows as he had once done, leaving her with the same emptiness she had carried for years. Her mind drifted back to that night, the fire, the gunshots, the smell of burning timber, the frantic energy of trying to save him. She remembered the exact moment she had realized he might not make it. How fear had twisted inside her chest, a cold weight that refused to let go. And then, the relief of seeing him live, only for it to be replaced by the unbearable cost, her home. Her family's legacy, her life appended in an instant. She had thought she was strong enough to endure it. But the years had shown her just how fragile even the strongest resolve could be. He finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the resonance of countless miles traveled and battles fought. He did not offer explanations immediately, nor did he seek forgiveness. Instead, he simply looked at her as if assessing whether the woman who had saved him was the same one standing there now. The Apache had a way of seeing beyond the surface, of recognizing the truths that people tried to hide from themselves. She shifted uneasily, sensing that his silence carried weight, that whatever was in that bag was not just a gift, but a symbol of debts owed, promises remembered, and paths yet to cross. The canyon stretched around them, empty but alive, the wind bending the sagebrush and carrying whispers that felt almost like warnings. She wondered if the desert remembered the night they had first met, if the stones and the cliffs had absorbed the violence and desperation, holding it in their hearts like an old wound. Every instinct in her told her that his return was no coincidence, that the past had come back with purpose, and that she had little choice but to face it. Her own life, shaped by the years of loss and quiet survival, seemed fragile in comparison to his presence. She remembered the isolation she had embraced, the walls she had built to keep others at a distance. The townsfolk rarely saw her anymore, except to whisper and speculate about the woman who had lost everything for a stranger. She had grown used to their judgments, to the cautious glances that followed her down the dusty streets. And yet, the Apache's arrival changed the rhythm of her existence, bringing the past into sharp relief and forcing her to confront the decisions she had buried deep inside her. He began to unpack the bag slowly, revealing items that seemed ordinary at first glance: a leather-bound journal, a small bundle of intricately carved wooden charms, and a pouch tied with fraying twine. But she could feel the significance of each piece, the careful thought behind their preservation. He had carried these items across deserts, rivers, and mountains, and the effort spoke of loyalty, remembrance, and perhaps a desire for redemption. Her fingers itched to reach out, to touch what he had brought, but she hesitated. She had been cautious for so long that even hope felt dangerous as she watched him. She realized she knew so little about who he had become in the years since that night. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? The Apache's eyes held stories she would not pry into yet. Hints of experiences that had hardened him, yet left a trace of the man she had once saved. The journal, she sensed, held fragments of that journey. Pages filled with encounters, choices, and the quiet reflections of a man living between worlds. And somehow, she knew that reading it would mean confronting not only his story, but her own. The night that had defined them both in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her curiosity battled with caution, each heartbeat a reminder of what she had already lost. She thought of the small cabin she had rebuilt, the careful routines she had established, and the quiet life she had carved from the wreckage of her past. Could she really open herself to the storm that his return promised? Could she face the questions that would inevitably follow? The truths about loyalty, survival, and the cost of choices made in desperation? The tension in the air thickened, a tangible force pressing against her. Demanding attention she could not ignore, he spoke again. This time mentioning places she had never known existed, lands he had crossed, and people who had shaped him after their fateful encounter. Each word painted a picture of hardship and resilience, of battles both visible and hidden, of promises kept in secret and dangers faced alone. She listened, rapt, realizing that the Apache had not only survived the violence of that night, but had also carried it forward, transforming it into something purposeful. The depth of his experiences mirrored the depth of her own loss, yet he bore it with a grace she had long thought impossible. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had imagined him all these years, if he was some memory conjured by loneliness and grief. But the weight of his presence, the certainty in his eyes, and the deliberate care with which he handled each object from the bag reminded her that he was very real. The past had returned to claim its place in her life, bringing with it both the promise of restitution and the shadow of unanswered questions. The desert around them grew darker, the last sliver of sun disappearing behind the cliffs. Shadows stretched long and sharp, curling around the cabin and the canyon like dark fingers. The wind carried distant sounds, rocks tumbling from unseen cliffs. The faint howl of a coyote, and she felt a sudden awareness that danger was never far from this place. The Apache's presence did not just bring memories. It brought reminders that the world was wild, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. And yet, in the midst of that tension, there was a fragile thread of hope. A sense that perhaps the past could be faced without succumbing entirely to it. She remembered the nights she had spent staring at the horizon, wondering if he had survived, if he had carried the memory of her courage, if he had remembered her at all. Now, standing before him, she saw that he had not forgotten. Every detail, every memory, every choice made in that desert long ago had been preserved in the careful way he carried the journal, the charms, and the bundle of twine. He had returned with a purpose, though she could not yet know what it was. Questions swirled in her mind, unspoken but pressing. Why had he come now, after all these years? What had he endured to bring these items back? Could she trust him? Or was this part of a larger plan she could not yet see? The tension between them was a living thing, stretching across the porch, crawling along the canyon floor, and settling into the very air they breathed. She could feel it, a quiet pressure that demanded answers, but refused to give them freely. The Apache closed the bag and rose, his movements deliberate, measured. He did not speak yet, but the air between them seemed to hum with anticipation. She wanted to ask him what each item meant, to demand an explanation for his sudden return. Yet, she knew that the answers would come in their own time, in their own way. For now, the weight of history hung between them, thick and unyielding. And she realized that this night, like that first one, was only the beginning. The canyon held its silence, vast and indifferent, while the stars began to appear, pinpricks of light in a sky growing steadily darker. The Apache's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, and she felt a shiver run through her. The night promised revelations, confrontations, and perhaps the rekindling of something she had thought lost forever. She took a cautious step forward, drawn by curiosity, by the unspoken bond forged in desperation, by the mystery that had carried him back into her life. And yet, just as the first question formed on her lips, a distant sound echoed through the canyon, a crack of movement, a rustle of shadows that reminded her that the desert never forgot, and neither did those who lingered in its dark corners. The Apache's gaze flicked toward the noise, his posture tensing, and she understood immediately. Whatever had brought him back was only part of the story. The past had returned, but the present was not without its own dangers. The night stretched ahead, full of unanswered questions, unresolved tension, and the promise that the story of the night she saved him and lost everything was far from over. The wind carried a chill now, colder than the memory of that long-ago night, and it seemed to seep into her bones as she watched the Apache shift his stance, listening intently to sounds only he could hear. The canyon had a way of hiding threats, of turning shadows into imagined figures, and she realized she had forgotten how dangerous the world could be when the balance was disturbed. Her life had become quiet and predictable, measured by the rhythm of the land and the steady hum of survival. But his return had thrown her into a new kind of reckoning, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She noticed a subtle tension in the Apache's jaw, the way his eyes flicked toward the cliffs, toward every distant rustle. There was more at stake than what he carried in the bag. Something had followed him back, a danger that had not existed before, or perhaps something that had waited all these years for him to return. She felt it in the air, a pressure that made the hairs on her arms rise, a warning that the past had not released him, that shadows from their old lives still lingered. Ready to strike, her own mind wandered back to the fire that had destroyed everything she loved. She had been so focused on saving him, so consumed by the immediacy of the danger, that she hadn't seen the long-term consequences. That night had been a turning point, not only for him, but for her as well. She had traded safety for courage, stability for a moral choice, and the world had demanded its price. The Apache's return reminded her of that cost. Each step he took toward her stirring the ache of loss she had tried to bury. The journal in the bag lay partially open, the leather soft from years of handling, pages yellowed and edges frayed. She could see the careful script, the looping handwriting that hinted at thoughts carried over endless miles. Each entry seemed to contain fragments of battles fought, places crossed, and decisions weighed in silence. It was more than a record, it was a chronicle of a life shaped by the same night she had saved him. And she realized that to read it would be to step fully back into a past she had never truly left. To confront not only his journey, but the ripple effects it had created in her own life. Meanwhile, the Apache's eyes scanned the horizon, noting patterns in the shadows that she could not perceive. There was a reason he had returned, and it was not simply to deliver these items. He had faced dangers in his travels, enemies who had left scars that ran deeper than the flesh. He had survived ambushes, betrayal, and long stretches of isolation. Each hardship had taught him vigilance, patience, and the subtle art of reading the world around him. She had saved his life once, but she understood now that the survival he carried was not owed to her alone. It was a skill honed in the crucible of a harsh, unrelenting world. She could feel the canyon shifting in mood, as though the land itself had sensed the collision of old debts and new dangers. Every echo from the cliffs, every distant animal cry, seemed amplified, carrying the weight of warning. She wanted to ask him what had drawn him back, what had been endured in the years since their separation, but the words caught in her throat. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that needed space to breathe before it could be articulated. The desert had its own pace, and she knew instinctively that the Apache moved in rhythm with it, letting time reveal what could not be forced. Her thoughts flicked to the townspeople, to the people she had tried to avoid over the years. They had watched her rebuild, had whispered about the woman who had lost everything for a man who was a stranger. She had assumed she was alone in her struggles. But now she wondered if his return might awaken not just old memories, but new conflicts. There were forces in the town and beyond, people who had benefited from her loss or resented her courage. His presence could stir more than hope. It could ignite old rivalries, resentments, and dangers that had lain dormant. As he carefully unpacked more from the bag, she noticed a small carved emblem, its shape intricate, almost ceremonial. The craftsmanship spoke of heritage and tradition, a connection to the Apache's past, to the life he had led before the night she had saved him. She felt a pang of curiosity mixed with fear. There was history here she could not touch, secrets woven into objects that had crossed years and landscapes. Each item seemed to tell its own story, and each story hinted at battles and choices she had no part in. Yet that had affected her life in ways she could not yet grasp. The night deepened, and the stars above seemed unusually bright, cold, and distant. She noticed how quiet the desert had become, the absence of wind for just a few heartbeats, making the tension almost tangible. He moved closer to the cabin, then stopped, as if sensing something just beyond sight. Her instincts told her to ask questions, to demand explanation. But she knew better than to break the fragile rhythm of the moment. Danger and revelation could not be rushed, not with forces she could not yet name. She thought about the bundle tied with fraying twine, wondering what it contained. She imagined maps, letters, maybe even remnants of a life she could no longer claim. But there was something else too, an intangible sense that it held answers or perhaps provocations. The Apache had returned not just to offer restitution, but to challenge her understanding of the past, to force her to see what had been hidden in the shadows of that night. And she sensed that if she accepted the contents, she would be stepping onto a path where the stakes were no longer measured in survival alone, but in the choices she had made and the consequences. She could not yet see. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment the canyon seemed to shrink, the cliffs pressing closer, the wind holding its breath. The tension between them was electric, charged with years of unspoken words, dangers survived, and debts unpaid. She realized that the Apache's return was more than personal. It was a signal that the world they had both inhabited, shaped by violence, courage, and survival, had unfinished business. Every movement he made, every object he revealed, seemed carefully calculated to test her, to see if she could face the echoes of her own choices. In the distance, a faint glimmer of movement caught her attention, a shadow sliding across the rocks, almost imperceptible. Her heart skipped, and she realized that whatever had followed him into this canyon might not be content to wait. Danger had a way of seeking out those tied to history, and she understood suddenly that their reunion could attract forces far older and more persistent than their own struggles. She glanced at him, noticing the subtle tightening of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near the strap of his bag. Ready for threats she could not yet perceive, the Apache spoke again, his voice a soft drawl, almost a whisper. But carrying authority and depth, he spoke of journeys through harsh lands, of people he had encountered who had tested his trust, and of choices that had demanded courage in the face of impossible odds. Each word added weight to the night, building suspense without revealing the full story. She realized that his path had been as complex and dangerous as her own losses, and that whatever he carried back was not simply a gift but a test, a reckoning, and perhaps a warning. The shadows lengthened, curling closer to the cabin, and she felt a sudden awareness that the night would not pass quietly. Every sound, the rustle of rocks, the snap of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote felt amplified, charged with potential threat. She understood that the Apache had not returned merely to restore what had been lost, but to confront dangers that still lingered in the periphery, dangers tied to their past and to choices neither of them could fully control. Her fingers itched to touch the journal, to unravel its stories, but she held back, sensing that the act of opening it would pull her into a current she could not escape. The tension between curiosity and caution was unbearable, yet unavoidable. The Apache moved with measured calm, aware of the stakes, aware of the threads of danger that wove through the canyon, and aware of her own hesitation. He did not need to speak to convey that this night would demand more than courage. It would demand insight, patience, and the willingness to face the unresolved conflicts of their intertwined pasts. The air felt alive. The canyon itself a silent observer of their reunion, of the weight of history pressed into the moment. She could almost hear the echoes of that long-ago night, the gunfire, the smoke, the desperate struggle to save a life. And she realized that the present danger, whatever it might be, was inseparable from those memories. It was inseparable from the choices they had both made. The Apache had returned, and with him the promise of restitution, revelation, and confrontation, but also the certainty that the past had not yet released its grip. Her breath caught as the wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent she could not identify. He noticed it too, his gaze sweeping the horizon, muscles tensing subtly. The night seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening, and the sense of unresolved danger pressing closer. The journal, the charms, the bundle of twine-all objects that had traveled across years and landscapes suddenly felt like keys to a puzzle whose final shape she could not yet see. The Apache's presence was a signal that the story was far from finished, that the conflicts they had long tried to bury were emerging once more, and that the next steps they took could carry consequences neither could fully predict. She wanted to ask him what the next move should be, how they could face whatever lingered in the darkness, yet she knew that answers would not come until the night revealed its full intent. Every instinct, every lesson learned in years of isolation urged patience, and yet, beneath that caution, a spark of anticipation burned. The night she had saved him had shaped them both, and now, with his return, the canyon itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first move in a confrontation that would test courage, loyalty, and the resilience of lives forever changed. The night had thickened, the darkness pressing into the canyon like a living thing. Every movement of wind through the cliffs, every distant echo of stone against stone made her pulse quicken. She had learned to read the desert, to know when danger was near, and now it seemed that the night itself was a warning. The Apache's presence, once a source of curiosity and relief, now carried the weight of anticipation, sense that the past and present were colliding in ways neither of them could ignore. He stood near the cabin, scanning the horizon with the calm intensity of a man who had survived countless threats. She noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as he adjusted the bag by his side, the subtle tightening of his jaw. There was something out there, something that had followed him into this canyon, something patient, dangerous, and unseen. She felt it too, a prickling sensation crawling along her skin. The instinctive awareness that the night was no longer quiet, and that every shadow might hide a threat. Her eyes drifted to the bag again. The journal, the charms, the bundle of twine, everything inside was heavy with meaning. She wanted to reach for them, to understand what he had endured and why he had returned, but instinct told her to wait. Danger, she had learned, was often disguised as curiosity. Every decision carried risk. And this night had already proven that the past was not a story easily left behind. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something metallic. Her stomach tightened. The Apache's eyes flicked toward the source, dark and unblinking, as if he had already calculated the possibilities. She had never seen him so alert, so tense, and a part of her feared that whatever waited in the shadows would not simply confront them, it would strike. She thought about the long years she had spent rebuilding her life, about the routines and walls she had constructed to protect herself. All of it seemed fragile now, standing against the weight of a night that had returned from the past with the force of a storm. Her hands flexed at her sides, remembering the first night she had saved him, the fear, the adrenaline, the desperate energy that had carried her through danger. And now, that same sense of urgency gripped her again, stronger, more insistent. The Apache moved closer, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. He set the bag down carefully, but this time his movements were guarded, deliberate, as if expecting an attack at any moment. She noticed the way his eyes swept the darkened canyon, noting patterns and shapes invisible to her. He had survived the wilderness for years, but she sensed that even his instincts had limits. There was a threat here that neither of them could ignore, and it seemed to grow with each passing moment. Her thoughts flicked to the town, to the people she had long tried to avoid. Could this danger reach beyond the canyon? Could the past she thought buried be returning to touch not just her, but everyone around her? She shook the notion away, forcing herself to focus on the immediate tension, on the presence beside her and the unknown that loomed just beyond the cliffs. The night was thick with possibilities. Each one seemed more dangerous than the last. The Apache finally spoke, his voice low, careful. He mentioned places she had never seen, events that had shaped him, threats that had pursued him silently. Each word added a layer of suspense, a sense that whatever had followed him here was no ordinary danger. She listened closely, feeling her own heartbeat quicken, as if the canyon itself were amplifying the tension. There was a rhythm to his story, a pulse of danger and anticipation that matched her own rising fear. Suddenly, a sound echoed across the cliffs, a sharp, deliberate noise that made her freeze. Rocks shifting? A branch snapping? Or something else entirely? She could not tell. The Apache's hand went to the strap of his bag, fingers brushing the worn leather, readying himself for whatever might emerge. Her own instincts screamed to run, to hide, yet she remained rooted, caught between fear and the need to understand. The tension between them was palpable, a silent agreement that the night demanded vigilance, patience, and courage. The shadows seemed to grow longer, moving almost with intent. She realized that the canyon was no longer just a backdrop. It had become a participant, a silent force amplifying every heartbeat, every whisper, every creaking branch. She could feel it pressing in, making the air heavy and thick with expectation. The Apache's eyes narrowed, his focus unwavering, and she sensed that the danger was closer than either of them had imagined. Her mind wandered briefly to the objects he had brought, the journal, the charms, the bundle of twine. Each item seemed to vibrate with meaning, as if holding clues not only to his survival, but to the threats that still lingered. Could these objects somehow warn them, guide them, or even protect them? She could not know, and yet the uncertainty itself added to the weight of the night, building suspense and fear in equal measure. Then a faint rustling came from the cliffs above, subtle but distinct. Her breath caught in her throat. The Apache's head turned sharply, his posture stiffening. She felt the tension in his body, the readiness for a confrontation, long anticipated but never realized. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint metallic temps that made her stomach twist. Danger was near. She knew it instinctively, and the night was stretching every second, every heartbeat, into a knife edge of anticipation. He moved toward her, silently indicating she should stay low, stay quiet. She obeyed, crouching near the cabin's porch, her eyes scanning the cliffs and shadows. Every instinct screamed that the moment of confrontation was imminent. She realized, with a mixture of fear and awe, that the Apache had returned not just to restore what she had lost, but to face something far larger. Danger that had lingered in the periphery of both their lives for years. Her thoughts flicked back to the night she had saved him, to the desperation, the fear, and the cost. It seemed impossible now that one act of courage could ripple through time, bringing them to this tense moment, facing a threat neither could fully predict. She felt the weight of responsibility, the mix of hope and dread that accompanied knowing the past. was about to collide with the present in the most intense way yet. The rustling grew louder, and she could see faint shapes moving along the cliffs. The Apache's hand rested on the strap of his bag, his stance defensive but ready to act. She sensed the layers of history here, the night that had defined them both. The years of survival and loss, the threats that had been stalking him unseen. And now, everything was converging. The suspense was nearly unbearable, the anticipation nearly tangible. Her heart pounded as the shapes drew closer, indistinct but deliberate. Each step seemed measured, almost as if whatever approach knew exactly what they were doing. The Apache's eyes never left the movement, calculating, prepared, aware. She realized suddenly that this was not just a test of courage, but of trust, of instincts honed through years of survival. And she understood that the night she had saved him, it set into motion a chain of events that was only now reaching its peak. A sudden gust of wind blew across the canyon, kicking up dust and sand, making it almost impossible to see. The shadows shifted violently, flickering in the dim light. The Apache's hand tightened on his bag, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Whatever danger was coming, it was patient, it was deliberate, and it was close. The tension in the air was a living thing, pressing in from all sides, and she realized that there was no turning back. The night demanded confrontation, demanded courage, and demanded that they face the unresolved conflicts of their past. Her eyes flicked to the journal one last time, its leather cover glowing faintly in the dim light. It was a symbol of the life they had both lived, of the paths they had walked separately, and the bond that had formed between them that night in the canyon. She wanted to reach for it, to understand, to gain some advantage, but instinct told her to wait. The storm was coming, and she knew that rushing into it could be fatal. Every instinct, every memory, every lesson learned from the desert itself urged patience. The shapes on the cliffs grew clearer, revealing movement that was deliberate and coordinated. She could see figures, faint but distinct, making their way down the rocky slope toward the cabin. The Apache shifted, stepping in front of her, ready to act, and she felt the full weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the climax they had been building toward, not yet the resolution, not yet the answers, but the point where danger, history, and consequence converged into a single, sharp moment of suspense. Her breath caught, her pulse raced, and she realized that everything the night she had saved him, the years of survival, the return of the Apache, the objects he carried, the shadows on the cliffs had led to this precise instant. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilled, the stars obscured by the darkness pressing in from every side. She and the Apache were poised on the edge of revelation, confrontation, and perhaps something far more dangerous than either could have anticipated. The figures moved closer, and she could feel the tension almost physically, as if the air itself had become a barrier, thick with anticipation. The Apache's eyes never left them, his muscles coiled, ready to strike. She felt her own resolve harden, the courage that had once compelled her to save him rising again in the face of the unknown. And yet the night was far from over, the danger far from fully revealed, and the suspense nearly unbearable. The climax was here, electric and immediate. But the resolution, the answers, the restitution, the reconciliation had yet to come. Every rustle, every shadow, every breath of wind amplified the intensity. She understood with sudden clarity that the night she had saved him had created ripples that had not only shaped their lives, but had attracted forces determined to test them once more. The Apache had returned, not just with objects or memories, but with a purpose that intertwined with hers in ways she could not yet comprehend. And as the figures drew closer, as the shadows pressed in, and as the night seemed to hold its breath, she knew that the confrontation, the true test of courage, loyalty, and survival was about to begin. The figures paused at the edge of the canyon, shadows against the darkened cliffs, hesitant in the presence of the Apache. He had stepped forward, his stance calm but commanding, the years of survival and hardship written into every line of his body. She realized as she crouched behind him that the danger they had sensed was not a random threat, but a force drawn by history, by choices made long ago, and by debts that could not be ignored. The air trembled with tension, each heartbeat echoing in the stillness of the night. Slowly, the figures revealed themselves to be a small group of men and women from the town, long thought lost to bitter rumors and the passage of time. Their faces were hard, shaped by hardship, yet there was recognition in their eyes, acknowledgement of the bond that had survived years of separation and silence. The Apache's gaze softened slightly as he realized that the danger was not malicious. It's only cautious, skeptical of the past, unsure of the present, but ready to understand. She felt a strange relief, the first in years, that the immediate threat was not of violence but of reconciliation. The Apache gestured for them to lower their weapons, and slowly, hesitation giving way to trust, they complied. The night air seemed to lighten slightly, the desert wind carrying away some of the oppressive tension that had built for hours. She stepped forward, her legs unsteady, the weight of years pressing against her chest, yet tempered by a cautious hope. This was the moment she had feared and longed for. The moment when the past could finally be confronted, and perhaps even healed. He began to speak, his voice steady and measured. Recounting the years of his journey after that night in the canyon, he told of challenges faced alone, of dangers narrowly escaped, and of the loyalty and guidance that had carried him through deserts and across rivers. Each word was deliberate, revealing the depth of his struggle and the careful consideration he had given to returning. She listened, feeling the weight of the past lift slightly, as understanding replaced uncertainty. He had not returned merely to restore what she had lost. He had come to honor the bond that had saved his life, and to offer restitution in the form of trust, truth, and shared history. The journal, once a source of suspense, became a bridge. He handed it to her with quiet reverence, allowing her to open its pages. She read slowly, tracing the lines of his journey. The names of places she had never known, the moments of fear and courage that had defined him. She realized that he had never forgotten her, never let the memory of that night fade, and that his return was the culmination of a silent promise kept across years and miles. Her own past, the sacrifices she had made, and the losses she had endured all converged in these pages, revealing a story of resilience and human connection stronger than time itself. The small objects he had brought, the charms, the carved emblem, and the bundle of twine, each found its place in the narrative. They were symbols, markers of journey and memory, each telling a part of a larger story she had been too afraid to confront. She held them one by one, feeling the textures, the weight, and the history carried in their careful preservation. They were not simply objects. They were threads of a life shared across hardship, the tangible evidence of courage, loyalty, and enduring bond. The town figures approached cautiously, their initial suspicion giving way to curiosity and acknowledgement. There were conversations, questions, and explanations, each adding clarity to the tangled history of that night. They shared memories of hardship and survival, of choices forced by circumstance, and the resilience required to endure. Slowly, the canyon seemed to release its hold on the tension, the shadows shrinking back as understanding and reconciliation took hold. The night, which had felt so oppressive, began to carry the promise of renewal, of connections restored and debts honored. She looked at the Apache, his eyes reflecting the faint light of the rising moon. There was relief there, but also quiet satisfaction. His mission was complete. Not only had he returned what was lost, but he had offered something more profound, the acknowledgement that courage, loyalty, and selfless action were never in vain. The canyon, once a place of fear and destruction, had transformed into a space of recognition and closure, a testament to the endurance of human spirit and the ties that bind lives together. They worked together, quietly and without fanfare, to restore a sense of order to the canyon and the cabin. The journal and objects were placed carefully, the remnants of past struggle given respect and purpose. Conversations flowed naturally, sharing stories of survival, hardship, and growth. She realized that the bonds formed in moments of crisis could withstand years of separation and the weight of loss. There was a subtle joy in witnessing reconciliation, a human connection that could neither be measured nor rushed, only acknowledged and honored. The Apache shared what he had learned in his travels, the lessons of patience, observation, and trust. She felt herself absorbing them, recognizing that these were not just stories of survival, but teachings of resilience. Each tale, each reflection, carried wisdom that applied to her own life, to the quiet courage she had exhibited in the years since that night, and to the choices she would face in the future. The suspense of the night had transformed into understanding, and the darkness of the canyon no longer threatened, rather framed a new beginning. Her own reflections deepened. She saw how the choices she had made, though costly, had been acts of courage, how those acts had created ripples that could bring restitution and connection even years later. She understood that loss was part of life, yet the human spirit had the capacity to reclaim, restore, and rebuild. The Apache's return was more than restitution. It was a lesson that, even in a harsh and unforgiving world, actions rooted in compassion and bravery could have lasting impact. The figures from the town, once wary, began to share small tokens of their own experiences, items and memories that connected them to the events of that fateful night. Each addition strengthened the web of connection, illustrating that lives are rarely isolated, that acts of courage and kindness ripple outward, influencing others in ways that may not be immediately visible. She felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders, replaced by a sense of belonging and shared understanding. The Apache looked at her, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. He had returned not only to give back what she had lost, but to reaffirm the human capacity for loyalty, bravery, and reconciliation. The night, once heavy with tension, now held a quiet resolution, the suspense giving way to a sense of closure without erasing the memories or the lessons learned. The canyon, witness to so much history, seemed to breathe, releasing its hold on fear and embracing the harmony of restored balance. She realized that the story of that night, her courage, the losses, the years of isolation, the Apache's journey, was no longer just a tale of survival, but of restoration and understanding. Each subplot, every thread of danger, hardship, and resilience had come together to create a narrative of human endurance. The objects he carried, the journal, and the recounting of events provided not only answers but a tangible sense of continuity and purpose. As dawn began to tint the sky with soft gold and pink, she felt a calm she had not known in years. The desert, once a reminder of loss and fear, had become a witness to reconciliation, courage recognized, and debts repaid. The Apache stood beside her, a silent partner in the shared journey. The bond between them reaffirmed and stronger for the trials endured. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and the shadows of the past, and emerged with clarity, understanding, and a renewed sense of human connection. She looked around the canyon, at the remnants of the night's tension now softened by dawn. The shadows had faded, the wind carried a gentler song, and the small community that had once been wearied now embraced the moment of shared reflection. She understood that courage was not measured by the absence of fear, but by the willingness to face it, and that the choices made in moments of desperation could ripple across years, affecting lives in ways both unexpected and profound. The Apache finally spoke, breaking the silence with words of gratitude and acknowledgement. He spoke of the bond forged that night, of the debts carried in silence, and of the deep respect he held for her bravery and resilience. She felt the sincerity in his words, a recognition of shared history and mutual courage that transcended time. The past, with all its pain and sacrifice, had returned not to punish, but to restore, to honor, and to teach. In that quiet morning light, she finally felt a sense of closure. The canyon had witnessed destruction and fear, but it had also borne witness to courage, loyalty, and the possibility of redemption. The objects he had carried, the journal, and the tales of his journey now rested in a space of meaning, a testament to lives shaped by choices, resilience, and human connection. She understood, deeply, that the night she saved him had been more than an act of courage. It had been a catalyst for growth, restoration, and understanding that, stretched across years and deserts, the Apache remained by her side as the town began to stir. The first signs of life bringing a gentle sense of continuity. They did not need words to understand the gravity of the night, the weight of years, or the significance of the restitution offered. It was a shared recognition, a quiet affirmation that courage and loyalty endure beyond immediate circumstances, and that even after great loss, restoration is possible. She finally allowed herself to breathe fully, the tight knot of fear, tension, and uncertainty dissolving. The desert, the canyon, the shadows, they had all played their part in the story. But now, in the light of dawn, she could see the path forward. The Apache had returned not only to give back what she had lost, but to illuminate the enduring truth that acts of courage and human connection are never truly wasted. As they stood together, looking out across the canyon, she realized that life, though often harsh and unpredictable, carries the capacity for restitution, understanding, and quiet triumph. The night had tested them, challenged them, and brought danger close, yet it had also offered clarity, reconciliation, and hope. And in that moment, with the desert stretching endlessly beyond, she knew that, though the past could never be erased, the future could be reclaimed, and that the night she had saved him had, in time, returned to give back everything it had once taken. Top of form, bottom of form,